When we talk about ancient Greece, it's a civilization known for its advances in philosophy, literature, science, mathematics, and the arts. And there was one of the innovations was that there was this ready supply of white marble, which is a perfect building material for their innovations in sculpture, creating lifelike, idealized human forms, and erecting buildings like this seen here at Delphi, with beautiful proportions and balance. The Greek peninsula, with its miles of coastline, fertile lands, and rugged mountains, as seen here, caused isolation between city-states, which were constantly at odds with each other and vying for supremacy, which made a cohesive peninsula difficult to accomplish. But Athens emerged as a powerful city-state, along with Sparta, Corinth, and others. And of course, they have miles and miles of coastline, so trade was encouraged around the Mediterranean. And this influence of other cultures had an interesting effect in two ways. They did embrace in the earlier periods influences from cultures like Egypt, but in the classical period of Greece, pride in Greek ways made them kind of codify or create unique Greek vocabulary in the visual arts. This independence of thought and action also led to democracy. So they regarded wisdom as a very important attribute and a curious mind, and to be inquisitive and to base decisions on reason, all important qualities. And men were only allowed to participate in democracy, however, and vote. Women were not. We'll talk more about the role of the Greek women later. But they did worship nature through gods and goddesses embodying natural elements. These gods and goddesses had very human forms and qualities, and so therefore Greek architecture is created more on a human scale. It's not the monumental, huge structures like we saw with the pyramids of Giza. I did a brief overview of the chronology of Greek art last class, but note that there's three formative periods. These three early phases, the geometric, orientalizing, and archaic, established the foundation of all the things that were to come after in the classical period. So then there's what they call the three mature periods of the classical, the 4th century, which is considered sort of the high water mark of Greek design, and then the Hellenistic period. And the art then, through these time periods, makes a journey to become increasingly realistic. To at the point from the Hellenistic period, it starts to actually look like individuals instead of it during the classical time where they're idealized human forms in the sculpture, for example. During the Hellenistic period, you start to see lifelike people with wrinkles and flabby muscles and things like that, which was not seen in the earlier periods. Just before this period, the late geometric, the Dorians, a group of what was considered barbarians at the time, a group of people from the north and west mountains, swept down into the Greek peninsula between 1100 and 950 BC, and they brought iron tools and new ideas with them. The Dork Order, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, is named after these people. And then as the Dorians came further down into the peninsula, several groups that had been living there fled. And so some of those groups landed on what is the coast of now Turkey, and which also became part of the Greek world. And they are called the Ionians, which is the Ionic Order is named after them. And then as the nation, the Greeks were considered somewhat isolationist. The different city-states unfortunately engaged in quite a bit of warfare among themselves, and there's different attributes that were given towards different city-states. So for example, the Spartans were considered to be very self-disciplined and warlike, the Athenians, the philosophers, historians, and artists, and of course we'll see a lot about Athens in today's lecture. We see vestiges of the earlier Mycenaean order or culture in these geometric period pots. So they're kind of limited in type and function and more formal in character, which was more like the Mycenaean style, with these horizontal bands of linear geometric patterns. And so this is also the time period, though, around 740, is actually in 776 BC, that the Olympic Games were initiated during this period. So this was another, innovation for the time. Notable motifs came in from the ancient Near East into the Greek vocabulary in the Orientalizing period, especially things such as stylized plants, animals and birds and mythical beasts, as well as decorations that we will associate with Greek designs, such as those spirals, or those volutes, and different types of goods came in from the Near East as well. So spices, perfume, textiles, ivory, precious metals that were being imported to Greeks at this point, and also ideas from Egypt. The Greek seafarers had traveled to Egypt, and they brought back some ideas from that culture as well. On this map, you see some of the city-states that were powerful during the Archaic time period, and this also saw the flourishing of some painting and sculpture, major forms of Greek artistic expression, and things like the site at Delphi being built upon in more and more detail. The architecture was becoming more recognizably powerful and recognizably Greek as well, with strong buildings with rows of columns and the use of trusses, which I'll break down during today's lecture, which creates that triangular shape of the roof. And this ended when the Persians, who had become a very powerful empire at this point, sacked Athens. And in 480 BCE, Xerxes led an invasion of Persians with a vast army, and they basically torched the entire Acropolis, which is the high point of the city, and burnt all the temples. And this led to an opportunity, though, to rebuild all of that in the classical style, which we'll talk about next. During the Archaic period, black figureware vase painting was the common mode of expression. So notice the pots get more refined in their decoration. So what happened is they would take what's called slip, which was applied, and that slip they would paint it in those areas that they wanted to turn black during firing, while the background was left the color of the clay. And then they could create details within that by incising the slip. You can see those kind of grooved lines, or by adding white and purple enhancements, mixing pigment into the clay to create some of those details in the figure. But a lot of what we know about Greek culture has come from these vase paintings, these different scenes that are very detailed, sometimes showing, furniture, legends, battles, like you can see here. Much of what we know about some of those things are done in this kind of graphic form, this graphic story form that records Greek history through the pottery. One of the most powerful city-states, or polis, was Athens. And a polis means a fortified area or a citadel, which offered protection during times of war. And so it came to be associated with urban centers. And these urban centers had, were a power base also, which their influence extended to the agricultural regions surrounding that area. And this provided resources through the payment of taxes to build the city center up. So again, one of the most powerful was under the rule of Pericles, and this is called the Golden Age, or the Greek Mature Period. The Pericles was a very wise statesperson, and he was leading Athens under a time of great flourishing, both in the arts, philosophy, and architecture. And he was an incredibly well-liked leader. He encouraged different types of advocated for common people, encouraged democracy, and encouraged great thinkers, writers, and artists. Some of the famous people like Socrates taught in the marketplace during this time. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, practiced during this time. And of course, we're going to see the Parthenon, one of the famous works of architecture, being erected during this time. So let's take a look more at this golden age. Pericles is statesman largely responsible for Athenian rise as a political and cultural influencer in the Greek area, became known, again, this era became known as the Golden Age. This age was bookended by the Greeks' defeat of the Persian army to begin this time period, and it ended with the war with Sparta, which ended this time period. So it's really roughly around the 4th century, which is considered, again, the height of classical civilization. And the innovations that were created during this short time period still reverberate out through culture in things like the dramatic arts, again, philosophy, medicine, and of course the history of the built environment in architecture and design. So we're going to take a closer look at that now. As I mentioned in our last lecture, this is the beautiful statue of either Zeus or Poseidon. This was found off Cape Artemision in 1928, and it was thought to have been recovered from a Roman shipwreck. So it was likely made in Greece and was being transported to Rome. And it's not known if it is Zeus or Poseidon because we don't know what it was holding. So if it had been holding the thunderbolt or lightning bolt, it would be Zeus, or a Triton, it would be Poseidon. Some scholars say because of the shape of the beard, it would be Zeus. But it's slightly over life size, and you can really see the mastery of the depiction of the human body that was coming to fruition during this 5th century, and again estimated to be created about 460 BCE. But notice that there's this light balancing on the feet, so it creates a very lifelike effect. Originally, it would have had more lifelike effects, so that the eyebrows, which are now missing, would have been, made from silver, the lips of copper, the eyes, which are missing, would have been some other material to create a more lifelike appearance. So, but I've been blessed to see this statue in person, and it really does look alive. It looks like he's going to hurl that lightning bolt at you any moment. So, again, another masterwork from the Greek classical period. This is an example of a marriage vase, or libsgamikos. This is used in marriage ceremonies to sprinkle the bride with water before the wedding, and then becomes a treasured focal point for a home to represent the marriage. And typically will show some kind of marriage scene. In this case, you can see a woman holding a baby as a blessing to the bride. So this is also showing that they're starting to do red figureware pottery, where they paint the slip on the background and keep the figures red to be able to create more lifelike scenes and flesh tones and folds in cloth and so forth. And as I said before, we know a lot about Greek culture from the pottery painting. So let's take a look. We'll take a look at more of those forms later. One of the celebrated art forms of the classical period is the sculpture, and specifically sculpting in marble to depict the human body in these very idealized forms. And during the classical period, there were Roman copies being created as well. So the Romans had started to adopt Greek culture and made direct copies of these statues, which then made these works travel forward in time and stay influential all the way through into the neoclassical era, where people would start to decorate their houses with these reproductions of classical statues back from this time period. Greek culture was starting to spread far and wide through things like not only their colonies, but again, Romans adopting a lot of Greek culture and their forms, but through conquest. We talked about Alexander the Great last lecture, who lived from 336 to 323 and conquered a huge area of Persia, Egypt, and to the Indus Valley in India within an 11-year period. But he was a huge patron of the arts, and so his conquest created cultural diffusion of Greek ideas and also natural history, their scientific discoveries. Greek philosophy was spread through this time period through a wide area of the world. The spread of Greek ideas is exemplified in these carvings from India, which is called Greco-Buddhism. Basically, Greek philosophers interacted with the Buddhist and Hindu mystics in India, and the first representation in sculpture of Buddha is said to be influenced by Greek sculptors. So again, the Greek artisans went along with Alexander's troops, and you can even see to the side of Buddha what looks like almost like a Greek god standing with the beard in the very classical pose. And so Buddha was never depicted in statuary form like this until the Greek artisans traveled to India, and we start to see depictions of Buddha still to this day, of him seated in these kind of flowing garments. So the point of this is, a lot of times as modern people, we think that it's a kind of a recent thing due to social media that we can connect worldwide. But in fact, people have been connecting and sharing ideas and philosophies and art forms and materials and, all different languages and everything, obviously, for centuries. And so this is not a new development for humanity. The death of Alexander marks the beginning of the Hellenistic period, where government broke into several kingdoms and royal families emerged and became patron of the arts and wanted to create demand for more luxury items. And prior to this, it was considered more, virtuous to be very humble. And so wealthy people didn't flaunt their wealth. They wanted to look more democratic. And so you'll see that when we look at the houses and so forth, they're done, in not a very grand style, where neighborhoods were all mixed together and there was no separation of social classes. During the Hellenistic period, we start to see that separation of classes. This is all when the Romans were creating copies of Greek statues, and you can see there's more diversity in the images. So they start to show, instead of an idealized human every time, a more realistic depiction of someone who might be elderly. Like you can see the wrinkles on this man's face. Depictions of children and different ethnic groups became more popular during this Hellenistic period. Different city-states used Acropolis, which again is the citadel or high fortified area of a city, but this is the most famous of them, and this is the Athenian Acropolis, which is the home of the Parthenon, one of the most famous buildings in the world that you can see here as well. But we'll be breaking down a few other buildings or talking about a few of the other buildings located here on this high plateau called the Acropolis in Athens. Here we see the most, I would say, influential building of the ancient world, and that's the Parthenon at the Acropolis. And this was the site of an older temple that had been destroyed by the Persians, and the Greeks waited some 40 years to rebuild it. And they asked, Pericles was in charge of rebuilding Athens after that destruction, and they asked the architects Ictinius and Callicrates, that's Ictinius and Callicrates, to build the building in this Doric order, which is one of the most basic of the three orders. And in the inside, even though the columns are Doric order, there's an Ionic frieze, and that is a sculptural band that goes around the whole inner colonnade. And the sculptures on the Parthenon were created by Phidias. So this is in honor of the goddess Athena. There was a competition between Athena and Poseidon, it was said, as to who was to become the patron of Athens. And Athena won that competition. So you'll see on the next few slides the frieze that would be up in the pediment, or that triangular shape of the building, that shows the competition between Athena and Poseidon on one side and the birth of Athena on the other. The building's aligned on an east-west axis so that the rising sun illuminates the statue of the goddess Athena that's held within the sanctuary. And it's aligned with the star cluster Hyades, and this also is, again, influential in that they were creating a visual perception technique where they were curving the base of the building, and you can see kind of tilting the columns in on the building to a vanishing point a mile above the building. So basically they were playing with forced perspective to help make the building look straight and aligned from a distance, so that they were able to compensate for our visual perception tendencies by doing so. And that was quite, advanced for the time, of course, too. It's also noted for its beautiful proportion, with 8 columns on the front and 17 on the side. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. But it's a symbol of Western democracy, or symbol of Western civilization, due to Greek democracy. So that's another reason why it's been used as a template for many government buildings. Some of the things that Greek architecture is known for, we've seen in earlier time periods. So for example, the post and lintel construction, as we know, was used in Egypt for the construction of their temples, and the use of colonnades, meaning rows of columns to support a roof structure. And symmetry and axial layout we saw at the Temple of Karnak, if you'll remember, and Luxor. But the Greeks also used those axial layouts, meaning if you draw a straight line through the center of the building is equal on either side of that straight line, symmetrical. But the Greeks were really, like I said, amazing for their use of adjustment for visual perception by tapering columns, curving platforms, and so forth. The use of a vanishing point and forcing the perspective helps to compensate for your visual perception from a distance so that the building looks straight. The use of orders, which we're going to talk about here in a moment, and then the high relief sculptures in the pediments of the building we talked about, and we'll discuss more on a few slides coming up. Their truss form is basically a triangle out of wood. So if you can kind of picture that as the roof support, where those trusses are spaced, every few feet to help support the roof structure. And the use of human figures as columns, which are called carotids, and we'll be showing you examples of those, and a noted sense of visual harmony and proportion. And this is why these buildings have stayed timeless and classic. The base of the building is also slightly curved to compensate for visual perception. And this is what it might have looked like back in this time period. On the pediment, which is that triangular shape above the columns, on the eastern side, it was showing the birth of Athena. And on the western end, it shows the contest between Athena and Poseidon to see who would become the patron god or goddess of Athens. And you need to understand that there was brilliant color applied to this white marble. So originally it wouldn't have looked white like this. It would have looked much, much more colorful. The columns are all made from large drums of white marble that are stacked so seamlessly that they look like they're one piece, and held together with some metal clips on the inside. And again, the notable thing about the building is just its refined proportion. So it's one reason why people have celebrated this and copied it for centuries. So that golden ratio is also called phi, or phi, after Phidias, the sculptor who created the frieze of the Parthenon. And it's this idea of proportion, again, that kind of Fibonacci sequence of sequence of things expanding out exponentially. So it's phi is 1.61803, and it goes on and on and on. This golden ratio is also used in the Great Pyramids of Giza, but it's this idea of the height and the width of the building and then the different components coming out, in a systematic sequence of proportions that makes the building so pleasing to look at. As I said, Phidias sculpted different figures along the outside of the building, and part of it was this frieze that went all the way around the building that was showing this procession that they would have. It's a ritual taken every 4 years in honor of the goddess Athena. And so all of Athens would have this large, basically, parade or processional, and this was depicted on the outside of the building, and so this is part of that frieze. In the 1700s and 1800s, there was a big resurgence of what they call Greek revivalism, and this is the British Museum, built in 1759, meant to emulate the style of the Parthenon with the pediment and the columns, the entablature, and so forth. But this is the home of what's called the Elgin Marbles, and Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and he was, the Ottoman Empire then ruled Greece, and he was noticing that some of the people living in Athens were taking the fallen sculptures that had fallen off the frieze of the Parthenon, and they were burning them up to create lime for new building projects. So he was horrified that this consequential building was being destroyed. So he removed the sculptures at his own expense until 1812. So 17 different figures from the pediment, more than half the work, it ended up in Britain. And so let's take a look at some of them there. You can see Phidias's incredible mastery of carving in marble with these sculptures. Notice the horses of Poseidon rising out from, this would have been in the pediment, and then the figures getting going from a reclining position up to upright to fill in that triangular shape of the pediment. But notice how the flowing marble, or how he made it look like the cloth was flowing in the wind out of this, substance marble, which is quite remarkable. And this has been a dispute between Greece and England. Greece wants these sculptures returned to them, rightfully so, but because the British have had them for a couple of centuries now, they're saying, I don't think we want to give them up. And so UNESCO is mediating between the Greeks and the British, and so far they've stayed in England, but again, the Greeks are lobbying to get them back. Another remarkable sculpture done by Phidias, this man who sculpted the frieze of the Parthenon, is this 40-foot tall statue that was housed in the back of the sanctuary as the goddess Athena Parthenos. And she's 40 feet tall. Her skin is made from elephant ivory veneers, and of course her golden garment is quite stunning, and she has precious jewels for eyes. This brings to mind that the worshippers did not go inside these temples. The temples were homes for the god or the goddess that were being celebrated by them, and they would typically house a large image of the god or goddess. So therefore all the rituals of worship happened outside the temple, and when the population was celebrating the god or goddess, they would have different processions around the building. So again, the building itself was the house for, in this case, the goddess Athena. There were reflecting pools near the entrance to the sanctuary that was said to cast this incredible glowing light onto the goddess statue. So you can only imagine the beauty and power of all that light reflection on the gold shimmering would create quite an impact. I can't really understate the importance of the Parthenon as far as the template that has been used for so many other buildings. You can see here in the Philadelphia Museum of Art facade, and of course different government buildings, college campuses, banks, state capitals, all different types of buildings throughout the world have used this classical style inspired by the Parthenon, and the Romans are going to adopt this style as well. But there's specific details within those that will now break down so that you can identify them when you look at one of these buildings. The Greeks used 3 different orders in their construction, and the word order actually means a building style. So it encompasses, for the Greek and Roman styles, the type of column that's being used, the style of the capital and the detail on the capital, and the style and detail of the entablature, which is that beam-like member that spans across the columns on the front of the building, and these different details within the entablature. So we will take a closer look at these 3 orders: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The Dork Order is the oldest of the Greek orders and the most widely used, named after the Dorian people that inhabited the western areas of the Aegean Sea. And notice on the column itself, it's a muscular column with a very plain capital, and the column has no base on the bottom, no decorative base on the drum. And notice on the entablature, they have metopes and the triglyphs, which kind of divide the entablature into those rhythmic sections. So the main thing to note is the style and capital of the column, and this will help you decipher which is Doric, which is Ionic, and which is Corinthian. On the colonnade of the Parthenon, the inner row of columns are Ionic, and they have an Ionic frieze. So the entablature enables a continuous band of carving around the border. And this double row of columns actually extends the size of the building as well, enabling a larger roof. And they built those trusses. Of course, that creates that triangular shape of the pediment to get water, off the roof with rainfall. So that was another advantage of having a sloped roof versus a flat roof, like we've seen in other cultures. The Ionic Order originated in the eastern part of Greece, on the eastern side of the Aegean, and it's more decorative than the Doric Order. Notice the column is more slender, it has the decorative base, but the main thing to note are those volutes. So the capital has those spirals on either side, which, again, if you think back to the Phoenician capitals and even all the way back to the processional way of the Babylonians, those spirals were meant to look like stylized palm fronds. So these spirals, again, are abstracted plant forms. And then notice the entablature with the frieze that becomes part of the order. The Ionic is considered the most graceful of the 3 orders, and it's perfect for this temple that's also up on the Acropolis, and this is the Temple of Athena Nike, designed by Callicrates, and it is 23 feet tall from base to the apex of the pediment, and it's decorated with a continuous frieze in the Ionic way. This was destroyed by the Turks in 1686, but rebuilt in 1834 to this form. So it's quite small again, 27 feet by 18 feet. And on this, it's perched right on the side of the Acropolis, so there's a sheer cliff off one side. This was a place of worship for many centuries for the goddess Nike. And Nike is the goddess associated with victory in war, specifically. And there was a pit found here with many bronze figurines as offerings to Nike. One of the temples to Nike was destroyed by the Persians when they sacked the Acropolis in 1480. And then it was rebuilt in this form by the Athenians in 1420. There was a statue of Athena Nike carved out of wood with a pomegranate in her hand, but unusual for Nike statues, she had no wings. So there's that carving of the famous Nike of Samothrace on the very first slide of the slideshow, the Winged Victory, that is now housed at the Louvre, Paris. This Nike had no wings because, again, the people of Athens wanted her to stay with them and not fly away and give anyone else a victory. The third order, which was a later invention, is the Corinthian, thought to have been first introduced by the city of Corinth. And so it's very ornate. You can see it has this leafy capital. And these are acanthus leaves. And this was a sacred plant that symbolized rebirth. Notice it also has the decorative shaft and base and a frieze that is somewhat more plain. So typically using some kind of dental moldings or so forth. We'll talk more about dental moldings coming up. But the Corinthian order became a favorite of the Romans. So we'll see quite a few Roman buildings using this order. This is a reproduction of a Corinthian capital in Roman style at the Getty Villa in Malibu. So if you have a chance to go up there once it reopens, it's a great chance to see some of these details. And you get a good look at that leafy acanthus leaf capital combined with the volutes on the Corinthian order. This gives you a better idea of the original layout of the Acropolis, where you can see the Parthenon is the highest building to the goddess Athena, the Propylaea, which was the symbolic gateway to the Acropolis, and notice the Temple of Athena Nike perched there on the edge with that sheer drop off on one side. And now we're going to talk about the pink building. It's not pink in reality, but on this slide, which is the The Erechtheion is the temple on the north side of the Acropolis dedicated to both Poseidon and Athena. Phidias did the sculptures seen here, and if you can picture this originally with black limestone in the background, and these white figures would be dancing in front of that black backdrop. These are the maidens of Carai, or this is also called the Porch of the Maidens. And these figures that act as columns, but in human form, are called carotids. So if you think of a carotid artery, that will help you remember that. These were actual maidens that performed the dance of harvest every year with baskets of reeds on their head, and they would do a graceful dance. And these sculptures of females, can see no two quite alike, are thought to be emulating those maidens of Carai with those waving baskets of reeds. And these maidens of Carai, or the carotids, have been copied for many buildings, especially the Romans were a big fan of carotid forms. So let's take a look at some other details for the Erechtheion. Notice the decorative moldings around the figures. So we'll talk about those molding details coming up, but those have symbolism of life and rebirth also. And then if you can picture this, that they used to have gold around the bases of the dancers and with glass inlay, and that they would have been painted brightly. And as I said, this building was added onto over different time periods, and there's different sacred things around the building, like an olive tree that's said to be Athena's olive tree, a hole through the roof that goes down into the ground near the building that was thought to be a thunderbolt from Zeus that is marked in the bedrock. And so the building itself has kind of a funky design, but that entablature going around links all of these different pieces together. Like the Egyptian buildings and the important dwellings in the Middle East, the temples in the Parthenon or the Acropolis are no exception in that they were brightly painted, and typically with a blue background, like you see here. This is part of the Parthenon frieze of that procession that rims the building, and this is what it would have originally looked like with the painted background and the figures painted with a lot of dimension. As a matter of fact, the horses had holes in their faces to put literal bridles and gold embellishments on the painting. So this is how they made it look more three-dimensional, by taking those kinds of details and bringing them to life with actual objects. And then you can see the Greek key or fret on the top part of the entablature, as well as what's called a leaf and dart, a motif, which is another symbol of life and death, or that cycle of life. Okay, the stoa is the Greek version of a shopping area. The building would be office space, or for magistrates and other types of offices for different businesses. And then this colonnade would support open stalls for vendors, like a farmer's market. And the artisans would work out of the stoa as well. And so this was a community gathering place. And although wealthy women were not allowed to be seen in public, so they would typically send servants to go do their shopping for them. The Greeks also invented the form of the amphitheater, which we still use today. So they were known for writing Greek tragedy for plays at first, and then later comedy. And they would be performed by masked actors that had little megaphones inside their mask to help project their voice. But the design of the amphitheater would also create good acoustics, because they would fill that trough around the stage with water. And we know that sound travels faster over water, which would help carry the voice up. And the shape of the amphitheater itself helps keep the voice aloft and moving up to those upper rows. So again, very ingenious use of design from this time period. The Greek homes up until the Hellenistic period tended to be small and unpretentious, built around a central courtyard. The earlier versions would have a thatching of the roof, later versions the red tile roof like you see here. And a lot of the spaces didn't have windows, they just had doorways that opened into that central courtyard to allow light and air in. So the Greek ideal of less is more was to reflect the democratic ideals that all were equal. So they really frowned on any kind of ostentatious display. They did have water that ran into a cistern, you can see like in the courtyard, and the men had their special space called an andron, and the women had theirs called the gymnasium. So the floors tended to be compacted earth, sometimes stone. They would occasionally have mosaics on the in the andron. The floors were often covered in woven mats from woven plant fibers. And later, the floors were plastered and painted, or again using mosaics during the Hellenistic period were common. The walls were typically whitewashed, like you see here. And they did have some rudimentary plumbing. They had terracotta bathtubs, and the ceilings within the rooms were quite high, about 13 feet high, and oftentimes painted or coffered. So let's take a closer look at the floor plan next. Notice the andron on the bottom right corner of the slide. This was the meeting room in the home reserved for men, where they held symposium discussing philosophy and politics. They were social events with food and wine, and they would recline on a piece of furniture called a klein, and the servants carried those over for them. So it was BYO furniture instead of BYOB. They would line the walls of the andron with these klein, and this would, again, create a situation where they could all kind of lean on one elbow and discuss events of the day. As I mentioned before, men and women led very separate lives, and particularly middle class and wealthy women were quite confined to the home. In the gymnasium, which was the women's quarters, and there they would spend great hours of the day doing weaving. And the Greeks were also great sheep herders, so they would spin and card and weave wool and create textiles for the household, and then also take care of children. And then you can see on the bottom part of the slide the andron, and that configuration of cleaning, or the couches that the men would use to have their discussion. The women also were not allowed to vote, and like I said, weren't seen in public that often as well. Sounds like not much fun, if you ask me. In wealthier homes during Hellenistic time period, there would be the use of mosaics on the floor of the andron. And here's one that's called a mosaic using tessera, which are basically bits of stone or glass or ceramics that are cut into specific sizes. So this would enable this kind of a pattern, in this case the meander pattern, or the Greek key or fret pattern that you see here. And recall that that was a symbol of eternal life, that was named after that meandering river with a lot of twists and turns in it, and that symbol then became synonymous with the flows and the twists and turns of life. Another beautiful form of mosaics that the Greeks created were called Pebble Mosaics, and that's where they're just taking different colors pebbles and making these very intricate scenes, as seen here. This is the acanthus plant that is the symbol of the cycle of life. Another one of those plants, like the way the Minoans use the lily plant to depict that idea of life renewing itself, because it's a plant that dies all the way back in the winter and then springs back vigorously in the spring. And we'll see these acanthus leaf motifs being used throughout Greece, Rome, and then all the way through in the Renaissance into the neoclassical era. And even in places like Balboa Park, there's quite a few acanthus leaf details on the plaster work there. So next time you're at Balboa Park, check it out. Other symbols of life renewing itself is the egg and dart motif that you see at the top band of pattern here. So you can see the egg shapes alternating with those vertical lines, which are the darts. A variation of that is the bead and reel, which looks like a necklace. You see those rounded egg shapes with the two dart shapes. And then the Anthemion border, which is a stylized honeysuckle pattern. So that's another plant that, again, grows back vigorously every spring and summer. And so all of these are representing those cycles of life. A variation to the egg and dart is the leaf and dart, seen here, where you can see the leaf shape interspersed or alternating with those, again, vertical lines that look like the tip of a spear, and that's the leaf and dart pattern. These decorative stylized plant forms, such as the egg and dart, leaf and dart, bead and reel, and anthemion, and the Greek key and fret, were also used not only in architecture but in other decorative arts such as the pottery. And so we'll see some examples of that coming up. An antefix is a vertical block which terminates or creates a focal point at the top of the pediment. And oftentimes in Greece they would be with these anthemion or honeysuckle patterns, often called also a palmette, and these again would serve to act as a focal point on the top of the pediment. It was common to combine these elements, such as the anthemion motif, with other decorative things like the lion head downspouts, which would drain water off the side of the building so it wouldn't discolor the plaster or the marble. The Greek key or fret is one of those symbols that we see in many cultures throughout humanity, throughout the centuries, and the Greek version of it dates back to at least the geometric period from 1000 BC. And we still see it used today in fashion designer Versace's work, for example. The Greek key is often used as one of their icons. So something that has definitely withstood the test of time. A Giosh pattern is a decorative pattern of running bands that typically are interwoven in a way that creates these kind of circular voids at the centers, which enables usually a rosette or some kind of flower to be put in that focal point position. This design has been found all the way back to ancient Assyria, but it became quite popular in ancient Greece, and then the Romans adopted it as one of their prime decorative motifs as well. Remember, we saw it all the way back in the Minoan culture as well. A volute is a spiral in 3 dimensions, so a sculptural spiral, and forms the basis for the Ionic Order capitals seen here, but we'll see can be used in all different forms, such as the stair handrail on the next slide. Rosette is a flower that has radial symmetry from that center point, just like an actual daisy or that type of flower. In this case, we also see a seed of life motif in the center, which is again how a cell replicates. We also see the acanthus leaves that represent eternal rebirth. And then on the next slide, we'll see a rosette of a lily. That's another symbol of rebirth. A pediment seen here is a triangular space that forms the gable of a low-pitched roof. That's usually filled with carved relief in many cases for the Greeks. And again, this was due to the use of trusses, those triangular, using wooden joists to hold up the roof structure, that created that triangular shape at the end of the structure, and that also gave an opportunity to create carvings and so forth. Not much seen here, but that created a theme or a focal point over the entrance to the building. Next, we'll be discussing the Greek furniture. Most of the furniture was made from wood, but some made from stone or metal, some such as bronze, iron, gold, or even silver with inlays. They were also using carving and a lathe. Remember that tool that helped turn rounded forms to shape the furniture. And some of the grander furniture was decorated with ivory, shell, glass, and gold, but this was usually later in the Hellenistic period. The Greeks valued nothing in excess, so their furniture tends to be a little bit more clean line and simple than we'll see with some of the later Roman furniture. Very little of the Greek furniture survived because it was typically constructed from maple, oak, beech, or yew, sometimes willow. They're using mortise and tenon joinery held together with pegs and metal nails and glue. Often the fabrics included leather, wool, or sometimes even silk from Asia, when the cushions would be stuffed with feathers, wool, or even leaves. But one piece of furniture that has withstood the test of time is what's called a thronos, because these were typically carved either from stone, like seen here, if they would be in some place like an amphitheater, or sometimes with wood with special inlays, and basically this is where we get the word throne. So it was a chair of honor for an honored guest or dignitary, and this is again an example of one from a Greek theater and carved in marble that you can now see at the Getty Villa. Like the Mesopotamian furniture, because the Greek furniture was made from wood, very little of it has survived. And so what we know of it is from the artwork, the carving seen here, or the vase painting. And this is what's called the Kleesmos Chair. And if there's one piece of furniture besides the folding stool, you'll want to remember it's this one. This is the iconic chair for Greece, and then this form was used for many other cultures afterwards. But notice how it has what's called saber legs, which are those legs that kind of curve out they were originally thought to be, animal legs, but simplified. Using mortise and tenon joinery, you can see the end of the tenon there sticking through the leg. Notice the curve of the back that conforms to the curve of the body and the spine. So let's take a closer look at these chairs next. These are reproductions of the Kleesmos chair. Notice they're made from wood, and then they typically have woven strapping for the seat, and then a decorative cushion would be applied. Again, that would be stuffed with wool feathers or even leaves. Notice the splat, which is that vertical support, and the curved crest rail of the chair, which is the very top line of the chair. So all these curves make it a very pleasing, proportionate form of seating that women would often use for seating. And we often see, like I said, the men sitting in the cline. Here we see from a red figureware piece of pottery, a woman sitting with her lyre, L-Y-R-E, her lap harp, and sitting in a Kleesmos chair. And again, what we know of the furniture, we can see some of the details from these types of paintings. So you can see that woven leather cords on the seat of the chair and the mortise and tenon joinery again. This man, T.H. Rob Johns Gibbings, a British architect and furniture designer, made the reproduction of the Kleesmos that you saw on the last slide. He was a designer that worked for wealthy Americans such as Doris Duke and Thelma Chrysler, and also later in his life for people like Aristotle Onassis, Jackie Kennedy's second husband. But he was trying to recreate Greek furniture, and you'll see some examples of his work on the next slide as well. During the 18th century, there was a big interest in classicism or neoclassical styles, and these are chairs done by a man named Thomas Hope in a modified Kleesmos fashion. So we'll see this chair again is a form that's used throughout the centuries, even up to today on the next slide. The more common form of furniture was the difros, or four-legged stool. And you can see the legs of it were turned on a lathe, and then the seat typically was woven again with leather straps. And this was a common seat for most people. It would also be a task seat. So if they were sitting at their loom or someplace like that, they would sit on a difros typically. You can see in this depiction of furniture what's called the difros okladias, which is the Greek version of the X stool. Saw this form back in ancient Egypt. Again, so it folds in half, typically has a leather seat, and oftentimes either lion paw feet that are turned inward, which may have been the basis for some of the Asian furniture that has turned in lion paw feet as well through the trade routes. And then the next version would be with deer hoof feet, and that's for the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. I've mentioned the cline a few times, and this is an example of a person using a cline. So notice how it's used for banqueting, reclining on one elbow, hence the name, our name for reclining. It comes from the Greek for cline. And you can see the table underneath the cline. So oftentimes they would make the tables low so they could slide underneath that lounge bed and then be able to pull that out when they want to set platters down and so forth. In the design of the cline, they would use what's called a fulcrum as the headboard or the armrest to lean your elbow against. And then notice the turned legs. And then this would have had woven leather straps to support a thin pad to recline on. The trapeza, or three-legged table, shows the ingenuity of the Greeks in that, have you ever been to a restaurant where, do you remember how it feels like to go to a restaurant? I'm not sure I do. Anyway, have you ever been to a restaurant where you have a table and it keeps tipping and then you want to like wedge a coaster under it or something so it doesn't keep tilting? So if you think about the andron and the use of pebble mosaics or even mosaics with tessera, that created a somewhat uneven surface. And so when you have a three-legged table, there's only 3 points of contact on the floor, which tends to create greater stability than having a four-legged table. So this is hence the use in the Greek time of three-legged tables or trapeza. The Greeks also worked with a degree of abstraction in their works. You can see these kind of modified deer hoof foot for the one leg and then sort of a lion paw foot for the back legs in this particular trapeza. If you look at the beautiful lines of these deer-legged tables with the deer hoof feet, you can see the inspiration or the abstraction of that in the next slide on some of the more contemporary tables, and also the saber leg from the Kleesmos Chair being reinterpreted to a more contemporary console tables. So again, these forms are still with us. Like the Egyptians, the Greeks used chests to store linens and other types of cloth, and these are called kibotos. So they can be used either a large chest like this one, or a smaller coffer, which would hold small items such as jewelry or hair ornaments and so forth. And again, these would have that same kind of situation where they'd have the knob on the side and then the top to help secure the top of the chest to the body of the chest. This kibotos was said to be a funerary chest holding the cremated remains of Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, the King of Macedonia. So notice again the fine lion paw feet, the rosettes, the 16-pointed star, and the knobs to secure the lid of the chest to the body of the chest. Again, this was found in that grave site. It's estimated from about 330 BC, only about 8 inches high, to give you a sense of scale. The early Greeks had been shaping pottery using a potter's wheel from about 1800 BCE, and they kept refining the craft. If you'll recall the different pottery we saw through the geometric period, the Orientalizing period, the Archaic period, and then they reached its zenith here in the Classical Age when they started to paint in the blackware and redware figures. And what their subject matter was on these vases helped to outline daily life, as we saw. It shows depictions of people weaving cloth, playing instruments, and then also, of course, the furniture that we know about from the vases, but also showing heroic actions from people like Achilles, Hercules, some of the legends being depicted on the vases. And so the vases themselves, the different shapes had specific functions. So if you'll notice on the bottom shelf of this, with the one right here in the corner with the narrow neck and the two handles, that's an amphora shape, and that's used to store wine. And then the ones that have the wider mouth next to it, just to the right, are called craters. And anything with a wide mouth like that was used for mixing wine and water, which was the common beverage for the Greeks. So they had specific shapes and sizes for specific functions, whether it was to hold olive oil, a cosmetic, or water. They were all made specifically for that task. Black and red ware were, both types were produced in the last quarter of the 6th century to the first quarter of the 5th. And not only were they using the red and black, but they also used small amounts of white, gold, and red, like a reddish purple tone, to fill in some of the details. And so they would also use some incising, as you can see, to help create a more dimensional effect. So the black figureware was first, and they painted the slip on the areas where they wanted to stay black, sort of like a varnish. And then later they started to put that varnish coat on the back so that the lighter point could be the focal point. And then this enabled more detail and shading, and you can see the folds in the garments looking more dimensional than they do on the black figureware. So again, both were produced and both give us much information about Greek daily life. Also know that the vases, the black and red figureware, gives us a lot of information on the different types of motifs that were popular. So the ones that we saw in the architectural details, such as the anthemion, the Greek key or fret, the egg and dart, and some of those different motifs will also, or the Giosh patterns, will be seen on the pottery as well. That word of brazier means basically a heat source. So they would put hot coals in braziers, and it would be like a space heater, and have them located near where they were resting or seated. And of course, it also would act as a soft light source as well. The Greeks also used bronze, which again is a composite of about 88% copper, 12% tin. And this is done using lost wax casting for those amphora handles, for example. So they would again make the figure out of wax, and then make a mold around that, and then pour the hot metal into the mold. The wax would melt away, but holds on to that beautiful shaped image that you see here. This amphora also shows some chase work, where they would pound on the back of the metal to create those dimensional patterns of the leaves along the body of the vase. And then you can see the egg and dart pattern also incised along the rim and along that band around the where the vase swells out to the bottom part. So again, the patterns are repeated, and as we look through these next few slides, notice that toward the end, the very decorative one is more of Hellenistic style. So during the Greek classical period, remember, they wanted to embody that idea of nothing in excess. And then as they got, more, the city-states started to become associated more with royal families and more elaborate forms of decoration, and household goods became popular. So we'll see that it's called, again, the Hellenistic phase. As we move into the Hellenistic period, you can see things get a lot more decorative, but it's still inherently Greek in that it is serious. There are usually nothing very whimsical about Greek art. It reflects almost a anxiety about life, and some of the depictions of humanity, they're showing a lot of empathy toward the human condition. And so the Greek design always has this striving toward a well-ordered system of proportion and measured beauty that is logical and is instantly recognizable, in that their work did change, as we can see, over the centuries, but there's this underlying sense of continuity of humanity, that they have these ideals, but they're still embodying individuality in the character of the different pieces that we see. So a lot of times the forms will be very simple and basic, but there'll be these embellishments on it, like you can see on this vase, that enhance the work but don't contradict it. So the lines are not completely obscured. So there's this kind of clarity in Greek design. That is one reason it's remained something to be admired, and something that is still inspiring people even today. So even in the smallest detail, you can see why Greek work would be considered classic and timeless. If you look at this ring, the lines are so clean and simple, and the striking contrast of the dark bird against the white background makes it something that could be placed in any number of centuries. And so even though this is thousands of years old, it could definitely be something that would still be admired in the 21st century. The Greeks also used fresco and a variety of colors to create these beautiful painted effects in their work. And so they were crushing up iron oxides, such as red and yellow ochre, using natural clay that's been tinted also, using plant-based dyes and crushed minerals such as lapis lazuli, And then the purple from the murex snail to do the Tyrian purple like we've talked about. And then some of the more decorative work would even of gold leafing like we saw on Tutankhamun's tomb in the shrine in the treasury, and the use of marble and bronze accents to the work as well, to all create this very decorative effect on the architecture and the designs in the interior and the exterior. So when we look at this too, notice the females are done with lighter skin tone again, and the males a little darker skin tone. A little bit different in the pose. Notice how the shoulders are now turned the direction of the gaze. So prior to this with the Egyptian and the Minoan work, if you'll recall, the face would be in profile, but the shoulders turned front view and then the hips back in profile. But now they've got the body aligned, and you get that sense of depth with overlapping form also. So they're starting to work more with this kind of dimensional effects in the art. Therefore, the original colors of the Parthenon would have looked something more like this, with the strong combination of these kind of complementary colors of the orange terracottas playing off the blues, and these kind of golden accents as well. So how we know about this is there's remnants of the pigment still left on a lot of the buildings and statues, like you see here with this god's head with the red hair and the blue beard. So where Greeks were a bit whimsical was with their color choices and application, but these color choices made the character or the picture shown, if you notice on the slides before, like with the Battle of the Centaurs from the Parthenon, made them look much more realistic or three-dimensional. Fabric, like wood, typically doesn't withstand the test of time over centuries, so there's very little actual Greek fabrics left, only a few fragments. But we do know that they worked with a lot of wool. They were sheep herders, and so wool was plentiful, but they also used linen, silk, and cotton, which were imported. The wool making was typically the work of women, and we know that again based on the Greek vases and the depictions they have of women carding the wool, spinning the wool, sitting at their looms, weaving it into different patterns. They were also using natural mineral and vegetable dyes to dye the wool, as well as that Tyrian purple would be used if they could afford that. So again, the wool was spun into very fine yarn and woven in upright looms in their home. And so women spent many, many hours each day on these textile arts. Very little of the actual wooden furniture has remained, as I said, but we do know that there was plentiful woods available, and so that these pieces were typically made from these locally sourced woods, such as beech, citrus, maple, oak, and willow, with some inlays of imported ebony from Africa and ivory from Africa as well, and some metal inlays and semi-precious stones on the finer pieces of furniture. But again, the typical piece of furniture would just let the beauty of the wood be the ornamentation for the piece, without a lot of embellishments. Before we begin our discussion on the Roman Empire, we need to talk about the Etruscans, who is now believed came from Troy. So in that area of Turkey, Anatolia, the fall of Troy that's written about in the Iliad of Homer from about 1250 BC, it was thought that the Etruscans fled Turkey by 1200 BC and settled through the Greek islands and then here in this northern part of Italy, which is now called Tuscany, from Etruscan. Do you ever wonder where that word came from? Through DNA sampling, they've been able to prove this now. In 700 BC, they borrowed the Greek alphabet and started to write in Greek, and they were great admirers of Greek culture. For example, many Greek vases have been found in Etruscan burial sites. So from about 700 to 300 BCE was the peak of their culture. They were a Mediterranean trading power, living in interdependent city-states with a common language, religion, and culture, very similar to the Greek city-states system of government. And they were manufacturing different things, but they were very well known for their metal goods. So they worked in gold, silver, and pottery, exporting iron and food sources too, such as wine, olive oil, things that Tuscany is still known for even today. They were in contact with Greek through the different Greek colonies and also people of the Near East. And they were eventually absorbed by the Romans, and a lot of Etruscan customs were absorbed into Roman culture. Some of the Etruscans' building technologies, such as the barrel vaulted arch, were adopted by the Romans and became mainstays of Roman architecture. So when we talk about that barrel vaulted arch, you can see those individual stones that lay out around a scaffolding. Then they would mortar that into place, and this again became an essential building form for the Romans based on this Etruscan design. Notice the register of pattern on the facade also has those disc shapes like we saw back in the Minoan culture as well. The Etruscan style of building led for these temple forms that also had a pediment and these large, more unadorned columns. And they typically had stairs going up to the front of the temple versus stairs on all four sides of the temple like we saw with the Greek temples. These temple forms are written about in Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture. So we'll talk about Vitruvius more in a minute, but he was a Roman who wrote down and described different forms of architecture. And then this form, which now becomes known as the Tuscan Order, you can see has these plain, unadorned capitals and unfluted columns. And this will be written about also in Palladio's book on architecture. So this will have a impact on later architects such as Inigo Jones from England, who studied European architecture and studied in Italy specifically, and brought some of these Tuscan styles back in his design, as you can see, of St. Paul's Church in London. So these early forms of architecture reverberated forward in time, through the ages. As mentioned on the last slide, the Etruscans' influence on ancient Rome was profound. The Romans inherited many of the Etruscan cultural and artistic traditions. Everything from hydraulic engineering, temple design, religious ritual, and even things like fights with gladiators all have their roots in Etruscan civilization. And they also, of course, adopted, like I said, these different forms in the built environment as well. The private villa, the atrium, the impluvium, which we'll break down in a minute, and the temple forms. Some of what we know about Etruscan design is due to these necropolises, or cities of the dead. So these are burial sites. And we can see that Etruscan design is devoted to religious rites, omens, and signs from nature. When they created these tombs like the Mycenaean tholos, and then they were within these tombs they had treasures and plus everyday objects for the afterlife, very similar to the Egyptian tombs. So these tombs were often made from mud brick or adobe with wood columns and thatched roofs, and they were also using stone inside the temple. Excuse me. You can see they're building using the hillside as part of the building, like the Greek tholos form. And the homes of the Etruscans was thought very much like Greek design, that were built around a central courtyard with a cistern or a water well in the middle. As I mentioned on the last slide, the Etruscan tombs, there were thousands of these tombs that were organized in a city-like plan with cyclopean stonework. Remember those large bits of stone stacked on each other. and then these interior frescoes. So these wall frescoes were dated around 670 BCE. They were inspired by Greek frescoes, and there was about 6,000 graves with these different frescoes depicted. And because of the frescoes, we have a sense of the attitude of the people. And they had a very joyous attitude. The frescoes usually show a big celebration of life, a lot of banqueting, dancing, just joyful activities. The men were done with men's skin tone was this redder tone, the women in this whiter tone. The men and women seemed to share more equal stature and status than we had seen in the Greek culture, because it showed women at banquets, and some of the tomb art shows men and women, kind of on an equal footing. The Tomb of the Lionesses seen here, you can see this on the right, the lion or the leopard motif it's also called, is estimated to be from about 480 BCE, and showing this man holding an egg, which is a symbol of rebirth. So they're also showing some of those symbols like the egg and dart and things like from the Greeks that are alluding to that life renewing itself. This incredible sarcophagus was made from terracotta, and it would have been sculpted in pieces. And it shows the mastery of that art form that the Etruscans had. And this is because the white marble that we saw creating the beautiful statues in Greece was not so readily available in this part of the world, in the Italian peninsula. So even Greek colonists that lived in this area used terracotta for their sculptures of Greek gods and so forth. But you can see from the depiction of this woman the luxury of the culture. This would have obviously been a wealthy person's tomb, and her cremated remains would be held here. But notice the relaxed pose. And so they really, like the Egyptians, believed that how your life would go on into the afterlife. So we see these scenes of kind of relaxed enjoyment in the tombs and sarcophagus for the deceased. Etruscans may not have had the white marble readily available like they had in Greece, but they did have a large wealth in metal resources. So everything from copper, tin, and all the other requirements needed to make bronze. And so they were well known for their metalworking, and they were also a great maritime power. As a matter of fact, they were thought to be one of the pirates. They had a reputation of being pirates in the Mediterranean. But they were using these metal resources to manufacture a wide range of goods that they use for trade with different cultures. Very little Etruscan bronze has survived, however, because it was melted down later during the Roman Empire. So they were using casting, pouring molten metal into a mold and leaving it to solidify. And then they, as you can see, they were depicting different storylines within this sculpture. So the one in the middle is the famous story of Romulus and Remus being raised by the she-wolf Lupa. And those twins, there's a whole long story about that, but Romulus ended up being the founder of Rome, it was said, and so that's where Rome got its name. Another important trade resource for the Etruscans was what's called bucero ware, which is ceramics meant to look like bronze. So it has this kind of black glossy finish, very utilitarian in line, but very beautiful forms of the objects too. They also anthropomorphize some of the forms, so kind of create animal shapes in the urns and things that they were creating. And as we already saw with the sarcophagus, they were very wonderful workers in clay and terracotta. So they were making funerary urns with figures of the deceased and these kinds of containers that they were using for trade as well. This sarcophagus, called the Sarcophagus of the Spouses, and was created in about 520 BCE. And it shows this couple reclining on in the Greek style of what we would call a cline again. But it was quite unusual that the men and the women would both be reclining on this dining couch. Both the figures have highly stylized hair with these kind of braided hair coming down along their body. And again, this was quite unusual for men and women to be at a banquet on the same reclining couch. So it was thought that Etruscan women held more equal standing with men. And also the fact that they would often show these kinds of dining scenes in mortuaries. So it could be depicting a funeral feast in honor of the deceased, or maybe just this notion that the deceased are enjoying their afterlife. But in any event, this terracotta piece would have been made in different sections and put together, and it held the cremated remains of the couple. An important motif that we'll see transcend time is from the Etruscans originally, and that's called a phasis. It's the root of the word fascist. It originates from this idea, you can see the bundle of sticks that's wrapped around an axe head. And so the idea is that united together, you cannot be broken, but a single stick could be easily broken, but together they are strong. So the Etruscans developed this particular logo, if you will, and then the Romans adopted it, and then later other governments will adopt it as well, such as the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King in France, and then Mussolini and his fascists in Italy during World War II. But it's also used, as you can see on the eagle clutching the phasis, for the Senate and the House of the U.S. Congress use the phasis as a symbol of, again, that those that are joined together as one are stronger than they are as individuals. In 396, Romans captured settlements just north of Rome, Etruscan settlements, and destruction of these settlements marked the start of a long period in which Rome gradually takes over Etruscan towns, and by the 1st century BC, all of those had been absorbed by the Roman Republic. And so the Romans co-opted many of the Etruscans' motifs, building motifs, and technologies that they will use then to create innovative works in their own technology. So Romans also had been capturing Greek colonies at this point and started to adopt Greek motifs and even the Greek gods and goddesses, but giving them Roman names, Greek forms of sculpture, Greek forms of architecture. But the Romans were great engineers, so we'll see that they create amazing technology in concrete, for example, to build things like roads and bridges and lighthouses that help them cover a vast area of the world at the peak of the Roman Empire. One reason we know so much about Roman design is through this person, Vitruvius, and his 10 books of architecture, a volume called De Architectura. And if you've ever seen the illustration of Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci, that was based on these writings that became popular again during the Renaissance. But this also talks about in the book that a structure must have 3 important qualities, which is called the Vitruvian Triad. That it must be solid, meaning it must be well made and built to withstand the test of time. It must be useful, meaning it's built to fulfill its function well, or that it functions well as a design, and that it must be beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. And so we'll see these properties embodied in Roman design. The other reason these books were published was the fact that the Roman civilization was spreading out across the Mediterranean, and they wanted the builders in those far-flung areas to build like Romans. So this was a manual that outlined not only the styles of buildings, but also how to build them. So in the books, it talked about different types of mechanisms that we'll talk about later that enabled people to build these large structures in Roman style. So a very important name to remember is Vitruvius. We'll talk about him a few times during the class. The Romans in their designs borrowed both from the Etruscans and the Greeks. And you can see that in this temple. Notice that it's built with one access point from the front. And so very little regard was given to the sides and the back of the building. Sometimes those would be right up next to another structure, where the Parthenon had that group of stairs going all the way around the perimeter of the building. The Roman temples are built up on a platform, and notice they are using the Greek Ionic system in the pediment, so they're using those roof trusses that were developed by the Greeks. Unlike the Greeks, though, instead of using the white marble, again, the white marble wasn't available to the Romans, so they're using what's called tufa, which is sort of a pumice-like stone found all throughout the hillsides in Rome and in the ground all around the city, as well as travertine. And they were using that in replacement of the white marble. But the temple was a place of worship. It's similar to the way the Athenians thought of it, or the Greeks, that it was a place where the god or goddess abides. So they were considered an important meeting place. So for example, if someone needed to post an important speech, they would put it on a podium outside the temple. A victory parade would terminate at the temple. And they were also considered places for storage of both ritual and ceremonial items and offerings to the gods or goddesses. So this particular temple from Rome was built during the time of the Roman Republic. And we'll see that as a time where after, well, we'll talk more about that in a moment. During the time of the Roman Republic, Pompeii and Herculaneum were engulfed by the eruption of Vesuvius. So the Roman Republicans actually had overthrown the Etruscan rulers in 500 BC, but they kept many aspects of Etruscan art and architecture. Again, you can see here with that temple form. Then there was a republic era for about 4 centuries. It was never a democracy like Greece, meaning that there was a upper class or patrician class which controlled the government, and then the plebeians, which was the general body of Roman citizens, which didn't have as much power. Later, after the republic was overthrown, they became an empire, and that's when they started to stretch Roman civilization throughout Europe, all the way around the Mediterranean basin, and through the Middle East, and this is when it continues in that vein until about 550 AD. Now, when we look at Pompeii, because it was engulfed in this catastrophic event of this eruption, it gives us a lot of clues about Roman city life and building forms during this Republic time period. Pompeii is located near Naples in modern-day Italy, and it was considered a resort town. It sustained a population of about 11,000 people, and it had some of the foundation pieces of a Roman city, in that it had a forum, which was a public area, a public square, aqueduct system to get water to the city center, Roman baths and gym, which were always an important part of the city. We'll talk about these in more detail, and an amphitheater. The site was lost for 1,500 years after the eruption in 79 AD, when the city was covered in 13 to 20 feet of ash from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And it was later rediscovered, first in 1599 and then 1711. Both of those time periods, people found it and then covered it back up for various reasons we'll talk about in the future. And then by 1748, it started to be excavated, and this is when it sparked the neoclassical design movement in Europe. But some of the frescoes and mosaics and different things from this site have inspired design in many different eras coming up. Some of the reason we know about what happened to Pompeii and the other sister town of Herculaneum, which are both buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, is through the writings of Pliny the Younger, who was a lawyer, author, and magistrate. And he witnessed the eruption of Vesuvius, and he was able to do an eyewitness account in his writings of what it was like, what that event was like. This deadly and catastrophic eruption lasted for 2 days, and when the volcano blew, it said that the pumice and the molten rock was flung up 21 miles high, just to give you a sense of the power of the eruption. And it covered this whole area, not only Pompeii and Herculaneum, but all the surrounding area, with a deep layer, about a 6-foot layer of burning molten lava, asphyxiating any living beings who remain behind, also with the deadly gases. So there's been about 1,500 remains uncovered from this area, and unfortunately, again, there was a large loss of life, but the towns were well preserved, which gives us a hint about what the life was like during this Roman Republican era. This is the Forum of Pompeii as it stands today, and the Forum is the Civic Center. So it's basically the heart of the city, where they would have the government offices, the courts, the library, and the stoa, the different areas where people would congregate in the heart of the city. This slide shows the innovations in Roman building, and one of them was the use of concrete. So Roman concrete was developed in the 2nd century BCE, and the mortar that they used was a little bit different than what had been done in other cultures. So other cultures have used concrete, but the Romans included the use of volcanic sand, which is called pozzolana, which made Roman mortar very, very strong and very durable, and also made it that it could set underwater, which helped them build things like aqueducts and bridges and so forth. They poured concrete into molds to create more shapes and forms in building. The other innovative use is they were very good masons, meaning they did brickwork, and they stacked bricks and covered them in plaster to imitate marble. So let's take a closer look at some of that. So if you take a closer look at these columns, you'll see that they're actually diagonally stacked bricks on a kind of a herringbone pattern that were meant to imitate the Greeks' marble drums. And so remember, the Greeks made their marble drums in cylinders that they would then stack, but they would look seamless. The Romans created the same kind of an effect by creating brick and then plastering it over in these fluted columns to imitate the Greek versions. Whoever put these diagonally stacked bricked columns in the cafe at Caesar's Palace knew their building history and their homework, because again, most people maybe would not realize that this was a nod to the ancient Romans' ingenious use of brick. When the ruins were excavated in the mid-1700s, this grabbed the public's attention in a big way, and wealthy citizens who could afford it would travel down to Italy to see these ruins for themselves. So many notable architects, such as the Adams brothers, James and Robert Adam, came down and saw these ruins and then used these forms for their designs in the neoclassical era. Notice that they're using the Corinthian column that was adopted by the Greeks, and they used the Tuscan Order, the Dork, Ionic, Corinthian, and then they did a composite order as well. So the Romans, unlike the Greeks, were not immune, or they were actually welcomed innovation and change. So they freely incorporated designs from other cultures, where the Greeks kind of kept their standards very rigid and formulaic in a way. The Romans were able to adopt new innovations from other cultures and then make them their own. You might have noticed on the previous slides of the Ionic and Corinthian order that the Romans tended to make these orders much more fanciful, with a lot of extra ornamentation than what we saw in Greece. But they also included this new form, which is called a pilaster, which is a half column, typically non-structural, that is applied to the building to keep a visual rhythm across the facade or across the design of the building. So these pilasters, again, are just kind of coming out a quarter of the way that an actual structural column might. But again, they're used to create that balance and order on the design of the building. As I mentioned before, the Romans adopted the Etruscans' use of the barrel vaulted arch, seen here in these the small Colosseum or gathering place or stadium. And the repeat of the arches, this arcade is what that's called when you have arches repeated, creates great structural stability because the downward thrust of one arch supports the downward thrust of the arch adjacent to it. So they were using these kinds of forms to create all new kinds of possibilities in their designs of gathering places, both public architecture and city design and engineering. The Roman home took a few different forms. For a wealthy individual, they would have their private home named a domus, which would be a home inside city area. And they could also have a villa, which would be a home in an outlying area of the city. And they were a very patriarchal society, so you can see that reflected in some of the building design, similar to the Greeks as well, where they have the andron for the men's quarters or the men's gathering space. Many generations lived under one roof also. So the Roman home was built around two different courtyards. The public courtyard, which was called the atrium, which was an open courtyard covered with a center opening skylight, which allowed rain to flow into this pool called the impluvium. And there was a tank below the impluvium that stored water. This was the most lavishly furnished part of the house. So this was an area where they would have, you can see that table, the cartabulum, which was the marriage table, which they would store or show off some of their elements that show the family. So, for example, libos gamecos, or the marriage vase, and other things that were notable for the family would be displayed on the cartabulum. The atrium also served a practical purpose. It kept the rooms cooler. So as we know, water evaporates, and so the water from the impluvium, which was, again, that was from rainwater that would fall under that open skylight, and then be stored. But when the water would evaporate, that would create a cooling effect for the home. And this, again, would be more of the public space. They'd also have a small chapel, usually off the atrium, that was a family chapel. So similar to how the Greeks had the gymnasium, which is where the women congregated or were kind of kept in seclusion, if you will, out of the view of men that were not in the family, the Romans had what's called the peristyle, which is an open courtyard in the back of the house, which where they grew medicinal plants and herbs, and also plants that were just fragrant and lovely, such as roses, violets, and lilies were favorites. They would often have a water feature and statues as well, and they would dine outside in the peristyle on nice days. So this is where we get even our lifestyle here in California, where we have these kind of indoor-outdoor spaces, built around so that we can utilize the nice climate here in California. And this kind of template comes from these Mediterranean cultures of Greece and Rome. Unlike the Greeks, the Romans enjoyed a lot of detail and layer upon layer of rich decoration. The Greeks, again, remember, thought that less is more or nothing in excess, where the Romans tended to appreciate more detail and mix detail quite a bit. And that's reflected in one of their motifs that we see here called the grotesque. So it's these ones that have the linear line, and I'll talk about this more in our Zoom session, but it's got that vertical axis, and then you see a composite of creatures, both animals or things like griffins, lions with bird wings, satyrs, these little faces with horns on them, and that will be mixed with like vegetal motifs of flowers and vines and so forth. So we'll see these grotesques again as something that's going to be used again and again throughout the centuries, initiated here from the Romans. These were typical colors of the frescoes, deep golds and reds offset with blues and greens, and they often would have what's called trompe-l'oeil, or to fool the eye, meaning painted areas that look three-dimensional. So you can see those three-dimensional effects on that top register band of pattern on the fresco here, where it looks like the architecture is done with some perspective and looks more three-dimensional than the frescoes we've seen up till now. The Romans took the Greek use of the mosaics, like we saw the Greeks did those pebble mosaics and the ones with the cut-sized ceramics and glass and stone, which are called tessera. But the Romans took that technology of mosaic making and brought it to a very, very refined art form. You can see that it's three-dimensional in effect and extremely detailed with lots of shading in the imagery. They actually even did things called micro mosaics, where these tiny little pieces, maybe as big as a grain of rice, and then these beautifully detailed images. So the Roman mosaics are just quite incredible. This beautiful and intricate mosaic was found in the ruins of Pompeii, and it indicates the wealth of sea life that was there in the Bay of Naples, and some important food sources such as the squid and octopus, the calamari. But notice again the very fine size of the tessera and the different colors of tessera that enable this very dimensional effect in the mosaics. If you would like to see some Roman mosaics, a place you could visit is the Getty Villa in Malibu that has this outdoor one, and then in a few slides you can see a spectacular indoor mosaic. As I mentioned, the Romans had beautiful and refined mosaics, but they actually copied that from the Greeks also. So the Greeks started their mosaics somewhat in a more simple fashion, but by the 2nd century there was a Greek artist named Sosus of Pergamon who was using very sophisticated coloring and shading to create depth in his mosaics, and this was copied by others. So these artists were combining glass, shell, and rock and marble pieces to create these very amazing patterns. And of course they had no computers then to calculate out these kinds of geometric masterpieces. Also notice the use of the Giosh border that we saw from the Minoans and the Greek key and fret on the corners. So again, if you'd like to see these in person, the Getty Villa would be a good place to visit. A garment that was associated with the Roman Republic and then later into the empire is the toga. But this is really a Hollywood invention in the sense that most people did not wear a toga. It was actually a ceremonial garment that someone of great importance would wear, and it comprised of up to 21 feet of material. So it is oftentimes very heavily embellished, especially later during the imperial stage of Rome. And this came into fashion after 284 AD. So again, we have a common misconception that all Romans are running around in these togas. And in fact, most of them wore just a simple tunic, which was a dress form that kind of came to the knees, which was worn by all classes. And this kind of a toga would only be used for someone in a moment of ceremony. The generals and the emperors did have some very splendid regalia. Of course, this is reproductions of that. But note the Tyrian purple on the cloak of the one general's uniform. So again, this is from the murex snail that takes about 10,000 snails to create 6 pounds of liquid to dye 1 pound of cloth. And so basically a single cloak like the one you see here would require about 10,000 snails to create that. And so only the wealthy and powerful wore this color. We see the main building component that enabled the Romans to create very large structures, and this is the Roman barrel vaulted arch, using those individual stone pieces cut to fit around. You can see here a scaffolding, and then stabilized by the center stone, which is called a keystone, enabled these kinds of large structures such as the Colosseum to be built. The Roman Colosseum, one of the most iconic from the Roman Empire, is from 770 to 82 AD. It sat, or it does seat, if it had seats in it still, 50,000 people with 80 exits for enabling people to have a quick entrance and exit. It's made of concrete. The inside was clad with marble originally. And the bottom, it has the different orders. So you can see on the next slide, the bottom tier of the building has Dork Order, Ionic, Corinthian, and then pilasters up on the side. This also was innovative in that they would have mariners be at the top with sails and a series of pulleys and ropes that would help create shade awnings over the crowd. And of course, we know these were, the sites of different athletic competitions and other spectacles that would happen in this building. The Roman aqueducts also are a great example of taking that barrel vaulted arch and using it to great advantage. If you combine the length of all the aqueducts in ancient Rome, it equals about 500 miles. 29 miles of which were above ground, like this one, and the most underground. These were gravity-fed channels, and they transported water from cool mountain regions into city centers. And so this one, the Great Aqueduct of Segovia, transports water from the Rio Frio and the nearby mountains 20 miles into the heart of Segovia, Spain. And the water then goes into two different tanks, but it's at a height of 93 feet. And at the top of the structure is a U-shaped channel which the water travels down, and it's just gravity fed. Basically, the aqueduct gets sloped so that the water just flows with gravity into the middle of town. But notice that the granite blocks are completely unmortared. So this was made in the 1st century AD. It still stands today, which gives you a clue of how well that barrel vault arch works as a structural stable component. What stabilizes the whole thing is that keystone. And here you see that large stone at the top of, so you have the thrust from one arch going from the other arch. That's the part that holds the structure together. And then it gets ground down into, in this case, piers on either side, those vertical areas that the load of the arch transfers down to that pier and then down to the ground. The Romans also used the barrel vault combined with the half circle to create what's called an apse. And we'll see this apse shape being reused by the early churches. For the Christian churches, they use this apse shape, and they still do, for the altar. And then notice the skylight, the oculus, that lets in natural light. So this caldarium would have been the hot bath in the bath. And we'll take a look at some of the other areas of a typical Roman bath on the next slide. To Romans, the bath was a very important social networking place, as well as a place to go and cleanse. So you can see the caldarium, the hot bath. Then they have the tepidarium, a warm bath, the frigidarium, the cold bath, and then an outdoor swimming pool, and areas to have wrestling and other kinds of workouts, boxing, and so forth. These baths, again, were quite large. They were, for example, sometimes covered over 50 acres, providing gardens and libraries, dressing rooms, and exercise grounds. So, and it was an important part of Roman society to attend or, to visit the bath. Like, I guess it would be equivalent to going to the gym to us. This is the ruin of Trajan's Forum today in Rome, and if you do get a chance, I've been lucky enough to go to Rome a few times. It is quite incredible to see these things. And Trajan was an emperor from 98 AD to 117 AD. He's remembered as a very successful soldier and emperor. He presided over a really big period of military expansion and did extensive public building programs. So we'll see some artistic renditions of some of those original buildings for the Forum. So recall that the Forum is the Civic Center, that the ports and other important buildings are grouped around this area. You'll recall the Stoa was a forum used in Greece that was a marketplace. So offices would be in this location, and then areas for vendors to set up merchandise for people to shop would be located here on one area of the Forum. If you remember one thing from this lecture that will be very helpful in future lectures, this term basilica. And this is the Basilica Uppia, Trajan's Forum. The basilica was the courts. So this is where people would go to settle disputes and where the magistrates would meet. But notice the colonnade on either side of a large central open area. This is going to be the template for the early churches. And so we're going to be seeing this building form used over and over again in centuries coming up. A monument to Trajan that's still in Rome today is Trajan's Column, and this was erected to celebrate the Romans' victory in the Dacian Wars, which is in an area that's in now modern-day Ukraine near Romania. But this column is 125 feet high, and it's made from 20 colossal Carrara marble drums, each weighing about 32 tons, and they're hollow on the inside. So inside there's a spiral staircase with about 185 steps that gets you up to a viewing platform. And there's a continuous frieze or band of carving that illustrates scenes from that war. There's also these images of what's called a Draco. The Dacians used these windsocks that were made to look like fierce wolves or dragons, and then they would fill the windsocks with metal. So it was said that when the wind passed through these, you can see I think the dog head with the tongue out. Anyway, when the wind would pass through those, they would make a really eerie, otherworldly sound, and this was meant to intimidate the enemy troops. So if you're a fan of Harry Potter, perhaps that's one of the reasons Draco Malfoy is called Draco Malfoy, or the draconian laws from another Draco that was in Greece. But anyway, you'll see quite a bit of references in these kinds of names to different characters in literature. So again, this forum or civic center was a gathering place that included business, temples, basilicas, shops, platforms for people to give speeches, colonnades, walkways running around it, libraries, the Roman baths. Were all clustered around this heart of the city. And now we come to one of the most notable buildings from the time of the Roman Empire, and this is the Pantheon. Pan meaning all and Theo, gods. So it was a building that was created to pay tribute to all the gods and goddesses of the Roman Pantheon. Emperor Hadrian had this rebuilt. There was an original building here from 27 BC. He had it rebuilt in 120 AD, and again, inside there's statues for niches that are illuminated one at a time by a center oculus. But if you notice the front of the building, you have the Corinthian order and this Greek temple form of the pediment and the tall columns and colonnade. In 609 AD, it was consecrated as a Christian church. But what's notable about it is this incredibly beautiful dome that composes the interior of the building. So let's take a look at that. So with the Pantheon, you're looking at a sphere resting in a cylinder. And this sphere is 142 feet wide and 142 feet high. So basically just a circle or a ball shape. And this is cast in concrete. And they use what's called coffers. Those are those squares going up the sides of the circular dome to lighten the weight of the dome. So these cantilevers are poured into molds in the concrete, but again, that helps reduce the amount of weight. Speaking of weight, though, the walls at the bottom of the curve are 20 feet thick, and then as they go up to the top of the curve, they're about 4 feet thick. And this helps support that large oculus, which is about 30 feet in diameter at the top of the dome. And this allows sunlight to come in. Now, the front of the building faces east, so that it also allows the rising sunlight to come in. And as a matter of fact, on the solstice, the sun comes directly into the building at sunrise. Originally, this oculus was also used to let smoke rise from the center of the building. So it was said they did some animal sacrifices in the middle of the building for the gods and goddesses, and this allowed the smoke to rise. The niches that you see along the building would have held statues of the gods and goddesses, and as the sun rotates through the sky, those different niches would be illuminated. But again, now it's a Christian church, so those statues have been removed. Besides its astounding engineering to have this unsupported dome stay intact for all these centuries, this building has been very influential to other designers. So we'll see the work of Andrea Palladio in the Italian Renaissance being very much inspired by the Pantheon in his designs of things, Villa Rotunda or Villa Capra. Other designers like William Kent and his designs for Chiswick House that we'll study took a cue or took inspiration from the Pantheon. So it's quite a remarkable building. If you ever get a chance to visit it, I highly recommend it. The three main types of residential buildings in this time were what was called first the domus, which was a Roman single-family townhouse or a house built in an urban area. That included the atrium and peristyle that we saw in the houses when we discussed Pompeii. And then there's the villa, which is a home for a wealthy family, typically in the countryside. It was used often as a weekend retreat or a summertime retreat to get out of the heat of the city. These also acted as working farms with food production going on to support the family and their staff, if you will. And then the insula, which is the apartment, or also called the word for an apartment block in an urban area. And these were typically 4 to 5 floors high with ground floors on the shops, very similar to what we would see in an urban area today. And again, the majority of people that lived in urban areas lived in insula. This is a floor plan of a domus, and the main thing that you want to remember or note is that the Romans really strove to create interesting interiors. Where the Greeks kept things somewhat plain and austere, the Romans really designated certain functions for certain rooms, and also did quite a few decorative frescoes and mosaics and so forth, and decorative furniture for those rooms. Again, where the Greeks tended to just maybe put a mosaic in the andron and have very sparse furniture, the Romans had a much more opulent situation in these kinds of residences. So this again was for a multi-generational family that was led by an older male patriarch, and this was also the site of their business. So people would come in through the main doors, the public, through 3 and 4. That's literally called the throat of the house. And they would often enter past shops or even a tavern or a food stall, which as you can see on number 10, into the atrium with that open skylight. So the one word that you do want to remember in this is atrium. That's a word that we still use for an area that's lit from above with a skylight. And then the rooms around that would have different functions. So when you talk the tablinum, which you don't need to remember that word, but it's The words directly across from the entrance is where they would have pictures of their ancestors and things that related to the family's history. And then in the back, number 2 is the peristyle, so that's that courtyard in the back. In the triclinium, the dining room would often be located near that area. So the dining room would have 3 wide couches, and they would usually have groups of 9, so there'd be 3 people to a couch reclining on that. In this, I'll show you some pictures of what that might look like. And women would typically sit on chairs next, and the men would recline while they were dining. If you would like to visit a reproduction of a Roman villa, which again is a country house, this is the Getty Villa in Malibu, but it's a recreation of the Villa dei Papri, named after papyrus, because after it was rediscovered in the 1750s, many papyrus scrolls were found in the villa. So, and these papyrus scrolls were from Egypt, so that's why it's called Villa dei Papri. Easy for me to say. Anyway, this is a villa that was engulfed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Herculaneum, and this reproduction of it is probably the closest you're going to get to a Roman villa, an accurate Roman villa in our area. So villa were typically in the countryside or the seaside, and they were usually owned by some prominent citizen, like a senator, and they were considered a status symbol and a weekend retreat, but they always contained some kind of agricultural component. So even though many of them contained templates like, or elements like a domus in the city, like such as the atrium or the peristyle, they also had elements that were necessary for a working farm. So they would have outbuildings with olive presses, animal quarters, and again, they were not only entertaining guests, but they were also creating it as a working farm. This illustration shows the insula, which is the Roman apartment building, which was typically 4 to 5 floors high, and they were reached by communal stairs. On the ground floor, they typically had shops or taverns. See the little cafes, very similar to urban areas that we have today. They were obviously people that were not as wealthy as people that could own their own domus that lived in the apartment buildings, but it was estimated that by the 4th century, about 46,000 of these insula were built in the city of Rome. Now, unfortunately, because they were constructed of wood and then mud brick, but sometimes partially concrete, they were very likely to collapse, and also fires were breaking out since heating and cooking in the apartments was done by open blaze. So the apartments were clustered around an open courtyard, but again, they were tall, and the courtyards were very dark because, again, they were 4 to 5 stories high. So they were not a very safe or sanitary living condition. They had communal latrines on the ground floor, and they were very densely populated. And again, unfortunately, because there was no, of course, firefighting technology at the time, it was not a very safe place to live with the threat of collapse and fire. Here's another example of what's called a grotesque. So that's, again, it's that line of vertical ornamentation flanking either side of this person in the middle. So notice that on that line is symmetrical, and it has some kind of curving plant forms, and then mythological creatures, typically in this case griffins. And we have little angels, angelic figures on the bottom. But the word grotto or grotesque comes from the Italian word for cave, which is grotto, because near Rome some of these frescoes were found underground, and so that's why they're called a grotesque or grotto-esque. The reason I'm emphasizing this is we're going to see the emergence of grotesque again during the Renaissance, and then once again during the neoclassical era. So it's a motif that tends to come up and repeat quite a bit in the history of interiors. To give you a sense of how the mosaics and the frescoes might be in harmony with each other, this is the triclinium or dining room from the Villa de Livia, which was Emperor Augustus's wife from 30 to 20 BC. And this triclinium was partially underground. So this was at the summer villa. And remember, it gets very, very hot in the summer in Rome. So this was a retreat villa. And so the triclinium being partially underground created this cool effect for diners on the hot summer nights. But also they wanted to make it feel fresh and beautiful. So on the walls of the room is this beautiful fresco showing these trees with all kinds of fruit like pomegranates and different types of birds flying around. And if you get a chance to go to Rome, there's a museum right near the train station, and you can actually go inside and see this beautiful fresco. So it's quite breathtaking and very peaceful to see. Most people don't know about it, so it's not as heavily visited as places like the Vatican, but definitely worth seeing. Another reason Roman frescoes were notable is that they did three-dimensional effects called trompe-l'oeil, which is a French term that means fool the eye. But notice here that these columns and architectural elements look three-dimensional, but they're actually just painted on a flat surface. So there's 4 different styles of trompe-l'oeil. There's ones where they do faux finishes, like imitating marble. There's this type, which is architectural style that resembles architectural ornaments, plus ornate style, where they're showing landscape, which was the one we saw before, and then intricate style, which is showing fantastical structures and grotesques. And so all of these are combined to create these very complex and detailed frescoes. The Romans were also known for doing these type of mosaics where they're cutting marble in intricate ways to create dimensional effects and details. And keeping in mind they had no, of course, metal machinery to do these cuts. So again, with using only hand tools and smoothing, they were able to create these precise inlays that look so three-dimensional, like these three-dimensional cubes repeating on and on. So not only I admire the quality of the workmanship, but also the patience it would require to cut all of these things so perfectly and precisely to make something like this, and the ingenuity of figuring it out as well, just mathematically. Additional commonly used motifs included the laurel wreath, and this originated back in the Olympic Games when someone was victorious in, let's say, a wrestling match. They would be called what's called lauded or crowned with the laurel wreath, which was a symbol of victory. If you look on the next slide, you'll see Michael Phelps from the Athens Greek Olympics when he won some medals, and they reinstated the use of the laurel wreath on the head to crown the victor. So when you see those laurel wreaths on the buildings or different motifs in furniture, it's symbolizing that sense of victory. Another common motif we'll see used over the centuries from the Romans is what's called a festoon. And so it's this swag of, in this case, flowers kind of grouped together and carved with ribbons. And this is even, we still festoon things with, crepe paper, for example, when you're having a party. These were originally live plant forms. They would make long lays, if you will, of flowers and vines and drape buildings and things for festivals, but then that also got translated into these kind of carvings and decorative forms in architecture. Again, this word festoon we'll be talking about over the centuries keeps getting reused and repeated. Romans also used antefix on the apex of buildings and on the corners to create those decorative focal points. Sometimes, though, in the Romans, they would actually use full statues. And then they also used this Greek style of doing kind of a stylized plant form, in this case, a palmette, as an antefix. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you're thinking, oh my gosh, how much more can I absorb? And so I know this is a kind of a beastly PowerPoint. It's very long, but the reason it needs to be is that there's so many key pieces that were established in the history of furniture and interiors during this time that people have built on over the centuries. So if you'll just hang in there a little longer, you'll see that the Romans adopted the Greek forms of furniture, but then expanded on them too. So when we have the Greek thronos, that would be equivalent to what's called the solium. The Kleesmos cathedra, the Difros Oquidais is going to become the Silica Aurelius, a form we'll see used quite often, and so forth. So let's go through this, and we're almost done, I promise. As the Greeks called it a thronos, the Romans call it a solium. Either way, it's the chair of honor. In the Roman text, sometimes they said the chair would be reserved for emperors and gods, but in a Greek domus, it would be found in the atrium as a seat for an honored guest. The cathedra is the equivalent to the Kleesmos chair, but in the Roman version, you can see the proportions got a little bit more exaggerated and not as refined as what the Greeks had done. But this is the genesis of the word cathedral. Means, you know, the honored chair of the seat of the church. And so again, this is the Roman cathedra. The Romans also made use of wicker. So using reeds from local rivers, they would weave furniture and use that for different aspects of the house as well. Here you see, I guess, the Roman equivalent of a beauty salon, where the person's getting their hair done, one's holding up a mirror, and notice the person is sitting in a wicker chair with a little footrest, which was a combination. An important piece of furniture that you'll want to remember is the Silica Aurelius. You'll hear me talk about this piece many times in the class, but it's the folding stool. The reason it's important is it was the stool for the magistrates. So people wanted the judges to make a quick decision in a case, so they had them sit on these. It was said somewhat uncomfortable stools, so that they would do so. This is also one, remember, we saw from the Egyptians. Then the Greeks used it as the Difros Oquidais, and then we see it here as the Silica Aurelius, that X stool that folds. Equivalent to the Greek klein is the Roman lectus, and this is in a cubiculum, which is a bedroom. This would be their bed, basically. They would have wider versions of this in the triclinium in the dining room, but the sleeping version was a little narrower than that. So notice they're done with a lathe. The legs are turned. They use the fulcrum for the headrest, and they still have a little footstool as you're sitting on the bed, you can rest your feet on the stool. If you think about that too, that's smart because their floors are all cold with either mosaic or stone flooring, or even sometimes compacted earth. So this helped keep your feet off the cold floor. This would be the common configuration for the triclinium or dining room, called tri because it usually had those three day beds grouped around a central brazier or metal element that held hot coals. And this would be a common way that the Romans would dine. Again, the women would typically sit on chairs in the area too. The lectus form was also used for a sedan chair. So this was a chair that would have been carried, someone would have been carried through the city streets on this raised bed or platform, often with curtains drawn around for privacy. And this is the word for our modern word for car, sedan, comes from these types of transportation devices that were human powered. Another thing that the Romans adopted from the Greeks is the tripod table, a three-legged table. In this case, it's also a mensa, which is a Roman dining table. And these would be put in the triclinium amongst the sofas to, again, put food and wine and things like that on there for people to gather around. A unique form to the Romans was what's called a Monopodium Leg, which is a heavily carved leg, typically out of marble or stone, sometimes wood, that would be used to support. Sometimes a single monopodium leg would support a table. Oftentimes they were paired in groups of 3 to act as a table support. The monopodium legs would often have these interesting composites. So you can see here a satyr holding a baby with a lion paw foot. So these kinds of unusual combinations were popular. I had mentioned the cartabulum on an earlier slide, and this is a table that is located typically in the atrium of the domus, and it would have been used to put precious artifacts or family heirlooms on display, symbolize the family and the marriage. The Romans also had these folding types of tripods that were used either for tables or braziers. And if you look at the base of this, if you've ever sat in one of those folding chairs that compress and then they go into the sack of nylon, and then you can take it out if you're going to sit, at the ball game or someplace, or the soccer field or wherever you are. This is the same design basically as the Roman tripod folding table that was created centuries ago, in this case from the 1st century AD. The way Romans illuminated their interior was through these kind of oil lamps with floating wicks, usually made in pottery, iron, or in this case carved stone. And they were usually very embellished with decoration. You can see on this one. They were either executed singly, like this, that would be near, let's say, someone's bed, or done grouped together as a light fixture on a stand. And they also used candles and candle holders. So this was another thing that was helping to illuminate the interior. Bronze and stone candle holders were also used to illuminate the interior, and either that were small, something to again be put near a bed, or to be used for personal use at night, or much larger to illuminate a larger area of the grounds, for example, on the outside of the building. A beautiful example of an oil lamp, and then also the amazing technology of glass making that the Romans took to a high art form, is this piece, which is called a cage cup. And so the Roman glass came from Greek traditions, but they were able to evolve glass making to this kind of colorless glass, which was manufactured in this case by glass blowing, and then they had these smaller bridges of glass that would connect to the main body of the vessel and cage it. That's why it's called a cage cup. The Romans were the first to use glass in windows. So by the 1st century AD, they were using glass panes in windows for wealthier homes. And they used other different types of technology, also called cameo glass, which we'll see on the next slide. One technically innovative and challenging type of glass making that the Romans did was called cameo glass. That was a name later given to it, or Roman carved glass. And on the upper left-hand corner, you can see cameos that were popular during the Victorian era that were carved in either stone or shell and became a popular jewelry item. And then at the bottom, you see a Wedgwood vase or jasperware that was popular during the neoclassical era. And those were meant to emulate Roman cameo glass. But interestingly, the cameo glass itself was made to imitate carved cameo type sculptural jewelry from the Greeks. The technique for cameo glass is, they're not quite certain, but what they think is that the background was blown first using the lead pipe and blowing through that to create the shape of the vessel. Then it was dipped into this other color glass, the white typically, and then the glass would be carved away to create these dimensional scenes on the glass. So again, very technically difficult, and not much of it survives, but what is quite astounding. The other surprising thing about Roman glass is how modern it can look. So this is just different colored glass canes fused together. And some of their glassmaking techniques will continue to stay alive even through to today. We'll see, like, for example, Murano glass from Venice using some of these same techniques. Roman glass is very moving to me, or any ancient glass actually, because I just think, how did this vessel survive all these thousands of years to make it to where we can still see it today? So it's a testament to the lasting impression that these classical cultures have had on design.